Today, some of our best segments from the global lane. An EMP attack, not if, but when. Child human trafficking, the largest in U.S. history. Evangelical churches in a free fall. And coming for your children and arresting street preachers. The heat is on as summer temperatures rise in parts of the U.S. People in South Texas are enduring record high temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Power grid stresses may cause Texans and other Americans to experience rolling brownouts. But what would happen if the country experienced more than just temporary interruptions in the electrical power supply? Well, our next guest believes an electromagnetic pulse attack may not only be likely, but imminent. Historian Dr. William Fortune is a New York Times best-selling author and expert on EMPs. His latest novel is 5 Years After, a political thriller about the aftermath of an EMP attack in America. That's out in August. Bill, it's a pleasure to talk with you. So what would an EMP attack on America look like? What would happen?
Okay, EMP, shorthand for electromagnetic pulse. It's created by launching ICBM launch. North Korea would be a likely candidate. Loft a missile 200 miles above the United States, detonate the nuclear warhead, sets up a cascading electromagnetic effect known as the Compton effect. Hits the Earth's surface, feeds into our electrical wiring, it starts shorting out the entire power grid. If they launch 3 missiles, eastern, central, western United States, it would shut our grid down permanently. The frightening figures are upwards of 90% of all Americans would perish within a year or two with the electricity gone.
Wow. So why do you think this is likely even imminent?
For a lot of different reasons. Sooner or later, somebody's going to try to do this. We've known about this response to nuclear weapons for 40 or more years. North Korea is the one I watch closely, followed by Iran, and then terrorist third states that might obtain a nuclear weapon. It will happen at some point. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but at some point it will happen.
And that's because you're a historian, you look at military history and the use of weaponry, or what brought you to that conclusion?
Well, a weapon system has never been designed without being used. Catapults, bows, tanks, nuclear weapons. Sooner or later, somebody is going to use this against an opponent.
Who else would be the aggressors here? China, Russia, they have the technology. Who would do this other than North Korea?
I don't see Russia or China doing it because we would do it back. North Korea actually does already have the capability. North Korea has the capacity to launch a missile at least to the west coast of the United States, and they've had it for several years now. They're the players I worry about.
So how long would it take to restore order, normalcy? Would we ever get back to normal?
No. DOE studies several years back indicated that 50% to 80% of our power grid would still be offline 5 years later.
Okay, now let's talk about water, because people don't think about that. I mean, if you live out in the western part of the U.S., you're very focused on water because of the dry conditions. But what would it mean for the entire country when it comes to water supply?
Well, I'll ask you a quick question. When you got up this morning, where did your water come from?
Yeah, it came from my faucet.
Yes, yeah, it miraculously comes out of the faucet. It requires electrical power. Electricity is the fundamental building block of our society. We lose our water, we lose our food. About 20 days food is about the max for most towns. We lose medication, we lose command and control, we lose it all.
And there's a great emphasis right now, Bill, on electric vehicles. The president would like to see us move in that direction. So how about just combustible engines?
Well, what are called ICE, internal combustion engine cars. Estimates are any car made after about 1980, anywhere from 10 to 70 to 80% of those cars would short circuit as well.
So we'd really be out of luck, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and the frustrating thing of it is we are currently spending $1 trillion on green energy, and I support some of that, but we're not spending money on the basic infrastructure of electricity. The average component in our electrical grid is upwards of 40 years old. We're pumping electricity in 2023 in a 1970s, 1980s system. And we're actually decreasing our generating capacity at the moment, which is crazy.
Well, what else do we need to do then to protect our nation and people?
We need to have a robust return to generate electricity in a meaningful way using natural gas is one. Secondly, spare parts. All those spare parts we need, the big transformers, where do you think they're made?
China.
China. Yeah. We farmed out all the components of our electrical grid decades ago. That would be like on December 7th, 1941, we had to admit, gee, all our aircraft carriers are made in Japan. Our planes are made in Germany. We need a homegrown return of industrialization to support the electrical grid.
Okay, the novel is 5 years after, the latest in the series from Dr. William Fortune. Bill, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. That book's coming out in August, correct?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay, God bless. Here on the home front, The Sound of Freedom is a huge box office success. The Angel Studios film draws attention to the tragedy of child human trafficking right here in the United States. Joining us from our Washington, D.C. studio is Jessica Vaughn. She's Director for Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. Jessica, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, I know last April in your testimony before the House Subcommittee on Immigration, you said the Biden administration has implemented a policy that incentivizes the illegal entry of unaccompanied children into the United States. It's facilitated their exploitation and abuse. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, of course, describes it as the largest human smuggling operation in American history. So just how bad is it, Jessica?
It's terrible. We've never had such a bad problem with child labor trafficking and child sex trafficking. And it is enabled by the Biden administration's policies of catch and release at the border, and then the relocation of the migrants to their destinations with almost no questions asked, no monitoring of what's happening to the kids after they're let out of government custody, and no vetting of the people to whom they're released, and no enforcement at the workplace to detect child trafficking, no incentives for law enforcement agencies to try to disrupt these truly evil rings and individuals who engage in this trafficking. It's all just getting worse because the numbers continue to flow in over the border illegally, and it's really astonishing how much the Biden administration is willing to look the other way at this insidious practice, all to justify its mass immigration policies. There is so much that could be done. It's not something that is a force of nature. It's caused by the Biden policies. It's enriching the cartels who are engaged in this, but it can be stopped if there is a will on the part of the federal government and its partners to do so. But what we see instead is the continued incentivization of child trafficking, with even NGOs, charities, who are engaged supposedly in child welfare, actually enabling this trafficking by participating in turning these kids over to sponsors that they ask no questions of.
These trafficking syndicates also are making a lot of money smuggling children across the U.S. southern border. Is it only the Mexican cartels or are other criminal organizations involved in this?
Well, the Mexican cartels control the area right along our border with Mexico, but there are innumerable other organizations that are involved all along the way, whether it's the people who go around in communities in the sending countries and talk people into turning their children over to come to the border, or whether it's the government officials in Mexico and other countries that look the other way when it's coming through their country, whether it is the employers in the United States in the case of labor trafficking, or the people who are participating in the abuse of these minors in sex trafficking.
So how likely is it that politicians, government officials on the local, state, and federal level if not directly involved, or at least complicit in this activity in return for either money, political favors? What do you think?
Well, it can be both. I mean, in the case of labor trafficking, it is employers who want to lower their labor costs and get away with hiring children as cheap labor. In the case of criminal gangs who are trafficking girls for commercialized sex, I don't know that they're making political contributions, but they certainly are causing problems in these communities and using extortion to enrich themselves, which they then use to corrupt public officials to look the other way at this. But there are some states, for example, like Florida, that are trying to crack down on this and refusing to participate in the Biden administration's scheme to relocate all these migrants into Florida. They're not going to allow the smuggling. They're investigating the NGOs that are involved in some of this and the criminal enterprises that support it with fake identities, false employment, fake labor contracting companies, people, the criminal gangs running the prostitution rings. We can crack down on it. Florida is doing so. Texas is doing a little bit as well at the border. Every state could do it, but, it would be best if the federal government would use its authorities to shut down our border, which is the real source of it, because that's the only thing that's really going to stop it is when we get control of our border again.
Okay, the solution is in Washington, federal government. Jessica Vaughn, thank you for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it. American Evangelical Church in free fall. Recent findings from the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University found a growing decline in Christian beliefs and church attendance. George Barna is Director of Research at the ACU Center. George, thank you for joining us. So the American church isn't bouncing back the way we'd hoped for after the pandemic. Evangelicals are in trouble. So tell us what's happening and why.
Well, the big picture is when we look at some of the measures that often are looked at, like church attendance, we find that that has dropped since the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of people dropped out of church, never returned. If we look at what's happened in the last 6 years, there's been a very significant decline from 56% of adults attending at least once a month down to 35% now. So that's a huge shift. We look at Bible reading. Over the course of the pandemic, you would have thought that would have been a time where more people would have picked up God's word to get guidance, but turned out that was not the case. And so what we've seen is a decline from 37% reading the Bible outside of any kind of church events during the course of a week, 37% down now to about 33%. And even those people who consider themselves to be Christian, regardless of what their belief profile may indicate, if we just look at those who embrace the name of Christianity, that also has continued its skid over the last number of years. We've gone down below the 70% mark now. We're down at 68%. So for a nation that used to have more than 9 out of 10 of its adults who at least claim to be Christian, now down to 2 out of 3, that's something that we need to pay attention to.
And what I found most shocking, George, was your finding that only 55% of evangelicals believe that people are born sinners and can only find salvation in Jesus Christ. Did that shock you? This is a core evangelical Christian belief. Why do you think the church is faltering on that?
Well, there are some things that we know that even evangelical churches tend not to talk about very much. Sin is one of those issues. The reality of Satan is another one of those issues. When you start putting together the variety of things that evangelical churches, much less other Christian churches, don't talk about very much, you can begin to see why these patterns emerge. And so you've got that. And then also look at the fact that a third of the people who sit in evangelical churches every week would not probably qualify as born-again Christians. Only God really knows. But the research simply tries to estimate where do people stand spiritually. And when we ask people what they think will happen to them after they die, and we find that a third of the people that regularly attend evangelical churches do not believe that after they die they're going to go to heaven and only because they've confessed their sins and accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. That too is a core evangelical perspective, but you've got a large share of the people in those churches that don't buy it.
And you've been doing this for a long, long time. I know you've been doing this for many years. So does any of this surprise you, or do we see the culture starting to creep into the churches rather than the churches influencing the culture?
Yeah, honestly, this is a pattern that we started seeing about a quarter of a century ago, and it has simply continued. In evangelical churches, it's been a much slower decline than, say, in mainline churches or other Christian churches. But nevertheless, that decline has continued. And the pandemic was one of those opportunities for it to grow a little bit faster than normally it might have. So I think that's what we're seeing here. When we look even at things like people's perspectives on the sanctity of life, we find that among evangelicals, only 4 out of 10 would say that human life is sacred. And you've only got about half of them saying that abortion for any reason other than to spare the life of the mother or the child is morally unacceptable. So there's rampant biblical confusion or resistance even in evangelical churches across the country.
So what are the consequences of this then, not only for the church but our society as well, if this decline in core beliefs and church attendance continues?
Well, one of the things that we could suggest is that evangelical churches are losing their theological distinctives. As far as the public is concerned, now one Christian church is pretty much the same as any other. And it's hard to find evidence that that's not the case. Culturally, I think the scary part is that when you look to that group of people in our nation who can stand up biblically against many of the unusual, bizarre, immoral changes that are being proposed in public policy, that are being taught in our public schools, that parents are wrestling with as they're trying to figure out how to raise their children. In all of these areas, we're finding fewer and fewer people who embrace biblical perspectives, fewer and fewer people who are capable of defending biblical perspectives in the public square. And so it's one of those situations, I think, where all of us need to sit back and say, wow, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? And if I'm part of the solution, how committed am I to being out there in the marketplace, being that solution on a daily basis?
Okay, Salt and Light. George Barna of ACU's Cultural Research Center, thank you for taking the time to share those insights. We appreciate it, George.
Thank you so much.
It seems we now have a month for everything here in the United States. Black History Month, Cancer Awareness Month, and June is LGBT Pride Month. Participants recently held a parade in New York City where they made it clear they're queer and they're coming for your children. No wonder parents are pushing back against gender fluidity instruction in public schools. Christians are standing up, not discriminating against gays, but against childhood indoctrination. This year, police arrested a Christian man exercising his right to free speech on a public sidewalk at a pride rally in Reading, Pennsylvania. Damon Atkins explained to FaithWire's Dan Andros what happened when he encountered the police officer who arrested him.
I was going to say God is not the author of confusion. And soon as I said God, he was on me. But I just showed up. So, and I didn't come here to throw the sign says, Jesus says, go and sin no more. I'm not mad or aggressive with anyone across the street. I am aggressive towards sin. And that is it. I want everyone to know, including my brothers and sisters, my best friends, everyone here, you cannot live in willful sin. It's almost like I felt like it was the enemy telling me, you're going to be quiet. And I just felt like I thought of the First Amendment. It popped in my head like, no, sir, this is public property. I'm not being rude. I'm just here to spread the gospel, the good news. Jesus Christ saved me, and he can save everyone, including the officer.
Atkins admits he's still new in his faith. He's learning. And the lesson for him? Don't show up at a gay pride rally with a sin sign and speak from your heart. You can't do that in Reading, Pennsylvania, because you might offend someone. Folks, this arrest is outrageous. In America, we have a constitutional right to free speech. It's called the First Amendment. Atkins was not violent. He remained across the street from the demonstrators, yet he's now charged with criminal disorderly conduct and engaged in fighting. He says he's a street preacher who shares his message with people throughout the city, gay and straight. Yes, his methods may not be the ones I or other Christians might choose for sharing the gospel. I prefer establishing relationships with people, getting to know them, finding out what's going on in their lives, and then sharing how a relationship with Christ has changed me. Nevertheless, the world needs street preachers like Atkins, who unashamedly proclaim words of truth to bring conviction. All of us sin and fall short of the glory of God. Atkins knows that, and he wants to share it with the public. He says he loves everyone as Jesus loves them, and he only wants people to know that they can't keep sinning and also keep Jesus. It sounds like he's delivering a pretty simple gospel message, doesn't it? Meanwhile, the Human Rights Campaign has declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ Americans and their families because 75 anti-LGBTQ bills have been signed into law by states across the country. Folks, this is a great way to raise money, isn't it? Scare people into thinking that their rights are being stolen away from them by MAGA Republicans. Not true. No one is taking rights away from LGBTQ Americans. Federal law protects gays at their places of employment. They can marry. They can even perform in drag shows if they want to, just not in front of the kids in most places. And most of these laws protect young children from gay porn textbooks in school libraries and gender identity indoctrination in the classroom. Other laws prohibit gender reassignment surgeries and puberty-blocking hormones for minors. Most Americans prefer to let children make huge, life-altering decisions once they become mature adults. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels, YouTube, Twitter, iTunes, and on broadcast affiliates worldwide. And until next time, be blessed.